Chapter 19. The Chosen Path. There was a series of scraping and banging noises as 11 chairs were pushed roughly back from the large round table by 11 elderly men and women. The prince noticed that they each wore an ornamental dagger on a chain around their necks, but none reached for them. "How dare you enter this sanctuary?" a voice roared to the prince's left. A man rushed toward him, wearing green and black armor with gold gilding along the edges. The prince caught a glimpse of a portly face and a mustache before he swung the Valyrium sword and caught the man on the temple with the flat of the heavy blade, knocking him unconscious. The silence after the man fell to the floor was deafening. The prince moved swiftly forward, kicking the man's curved dagger away with his boot as he passed. The dagger clattered across the rough stone floor of the council chamber, where the only noise now was heavy breathing. The prince rounded the table, eyes locked on a single elder who sat on the far side, in a chair larger than the others. This old man was the only one of the 12 in the room who had remained seated, and the prince saw that there was no fear in his eyes, even though he sat unarmed in the face of an assassin. As the prince passed each elder, he noticed that their faces showed anger, defiance, and above all, pride. There was no fear, no resignation. A few of them had even moved in front of their chairs and assumed a defensive stance, as if ready to fight him, even without weapons, though none of them looked to be younger than 60 at best. But the prince didn't stop to engage them. He simply walked past. As his intention became clear, though, the elders moved to block his way. "You shall not approach Elder Crane," one of them said, the only one who had drawn his dagger. This elder was male and tall, taller than the prince, back straight even in old age, and he had dark blue eyes that demanded obedience. The prince raised his sword to dispatch him, but before he could, another voice spoke. "Please, Warren," the elder at the end of the table said. "Let him come." The others looked back in surprise, but the prince simply continued on, passing between them until he stood in front of the dignified leader. The prince gripped his sword in both hands, fell to one knee, and drove the blade into the ground. The Valyrium metal cut through the stone with a shower of sparks, leaving the blade half buried. "I have no time to ask for absolution, nor do I much care if you would grant it. You are in my mind rebels, criminals, and outlaws, but to you I am something much worse." He spoke quickly but clearly. There was very little time left. "I am not a runaway from the families of the Most High come to you with information, as has been reported. I am the Prince of Ravens, 7th son of the Empress of the Diamond Throne of Lucien, heir to the lands of the exiled kindred should I recapture them for the glory of the Empress and the Empire of Ages." He rose and pulled off his shirt, exposing the black markings of the talisman. Dead silence rang through the hall. He took a deep breath and forced himself to continue, staying calm and remaining cogent of his actions. "I renounce that claim. I renounce my claim to the Diamond Throne. I renounce my claim to the 7th Principality, and I renounce my claim to citizenship in the Empire of Ages, ruled by the Empress, known as the nation of Lucien." If the silence had been deep before, now it was profound. Each face bore the same look of shock, every face but the face of the head elder, this Elder Crane, who was studying the prince intently. The man's eyes, such a light blue that they were almost white, were looking at him in a strange way, as if seeing something familiar, and yet unexpected. The prince reached down and pulled the Valyrium sword from the ground. It slid out as easily as it had gone in, the metal so sharp that not even stone could bind it. The prince held it horizontally across his open palms and knelt. "My brother Ramael, the Prince of Oxen, is no more than a half-day's march from this very spot. The talisman that my mother has bestowed upon me allows me to sense his arrival, and it is my belief that he has in place a tracking spell that is leading him straight toward us and through your land's defenses. I and 4 others killed a demon in the Rourke Mountains not 3 days ago, and have remained in close proximity ever since. If a tracking spell is in place, Ramael will be able to track us even through your enchantments. He will find this place and he will attack. If you evacuate this valley and fall back to a more secure position, you might have a chance to fend him off, but from what I have seen of this city, should you stay here, you will be slaughtered, every last man, woman, and child. He is ruthless, and he will stop at nothing until the will of the Empress is fulfilled and each of you lies dead. If you run, and run fast, you have a chance. As a token of my honesty, I pledge myself and whatever aid I can give to the exiled kindred, until the Prince of Oxen and his invading army have been repulsed." He extended the white sword and waited for the elder's response. Before it came, the double doors swung inward, and men and women in heavy armor, accompanied by rogue and ranger pairs in gleaming silver, gold, and green, flooded through the doors. A spellblade spotted the prince, and before anyone could react, a dagger was flying across the intervening space, faster and straighter than an arrow. "Stop!" The word reverberated around the room, and the prince was left staring at a dagger that hung quivering in midair, point forward, not a hair's width away from his right eye. Slowly, Elder Crane rose. Silence filled the room as everyone present took in the sight of the old man and the young prince. Crane reached up and grabbed the hilt of the dagger. The prince waited, sweat beading on his face and in the small of his back. Crane pulled the dagger away. "How much time do we have?" the elder asked. The prince just barely stopped himself from letting out a sigh of relief. 2 hours at most before his scouts arrive, and the main army can't be more than 2 or 3 hours behind that, the prince said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. For a long moment, the elder stood staring at him as if he were trying to memorize the prince's face. What was the old man thinking? The blue eyes set in the lined face seemed to be weighing and measuring his entire life. The prince was reminded forcefully of his mother, and though he told himself that this man, this traitor, could never rival the Empress, he knew, somewhere deep inside himself, that a confrontation between the elder and the Empress would be akin to a war between gods. There was power in this man, far beyond what the prince had expected. Finally, the old man broke the gaze, and the prince let out a ragged breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There was another commotion at the door, and the prince looked back to see Tomaz and Leah, bound and gagged, brought into the room. Leah was kicking and fighting with all her might, and while Tomaz did struggle, no one seemed to want to lay a hand on him. "What is this?" Crane asked. "These two ambushed the guards and allowed that man to penetrate the chamber," a man who wore a cape and looked like a captain of the guards said. "The Ashandai caused a disturbance that drew off the guards at the door, while the Ashandel led them to her and allowed them to be ambushed. In the confusion, this man broke through." "Ah, I see," Elder Crane responded. "In that case, release them." There was a shocked moment of silence, and then the gags and bonds were cut and the two rogues freed. They seemed as surprised as everyone else. "I have just been informed," said Elder Crane, "that the Prince of Oxen is advancing on Vale with an army, killing our scouts and leaving us blind to his advance. We have reason to believe that he has penetrated our defenses without the use of an anchor, and will not be stopped short of a counterattack or well-prepared defense. His scouts will be arriving in 2 hours and his main force not long after. We will evacuate this valley and fall back to Amon's Stand. Generals, go with Elder Warren. Elders Lima and Stanton organize the evacuation. The rest, spread the word that the emergency teams should run to ground and organize distribution of supplies. Families, flee south. All able-bodied men and women willing to fight are to be given weapons. We will all meet again at the stand." Pandemonium broke out, like steam held too long under a tightly secured lid now released. The prince was almost overwhelmed by the sounds of shouting and riotous activity. The elders remained the calmest, giving orders and generally composing the soldiers, rangers, and rogues in the room with tasks, however menial, to do that would speed the evacuation. The prince remembered something his brother Ricard had said. True leaders know that action is the surest way to turn fear into courage. Give them something to do, give them a purpose, and they are yours to command. Elder Crane gave the impression of something solid, an eye in the storm forming around him, a deeply rooted boulder amid a rushing stream. "Rise," he said to the prince. The prince stood, sword still unsheathed in his bare hands. He was very careful not to touch the edge. He felt certain that the sharpness of the blade would cut him at the slightest touch. "Eshendai Goldwyn and Ashendal Bannier, come forward." Leah and Tamaz quickly joined them. Elder Crane focused on the prince. "I accept your loyalty, and I also understand you give it only until this crisis has passed. After it is over, we will talk more about your future. But for now, I would request that you sheathe that sword and put your shirt back on." The prince did so quickly. "I have a task for the three of you," Crane told them. "This evacuation must be covered. You three, Eshendai David Goldwyn and Ashandel Lorna Lamas, will help Captain Otmaron lead a group of scouts, rangers, and rogues on an ambush mission. Here." He motioned to a point on the table, which the prince now saw was carved to resemble an enormous map, "is where that ambush is to be set. The 5 of you, embedded among the larger force, will draw the Oxlord there and dispatch the blood mages tracking you. This should leave them in confusion and force them to slow their advance, buying us time to regroup at the stand." He turned to Leah and Tomaz. "You are to serve under the tactical command of Captain Otmaron, who will lead the ambush. Eshendai Goldwyn, your brother and Ashandel Lamas will be with you, and this young man here is to be used at your discretion, as you know more of his capabilities than I. Tell the captain to take 500 pairs and 1,000 scouts and use the passes through the backwoods once the ambush is complete. You and the captain, along with whomever he chooses as Eshendai and Ashandel lieutenants, are to report to me personally at the stand. Go." With that, he turned and began to examine the map carved into the tabletop, hands folded calmly behind his back, but his shoulders holding a tension that belied a mind thinking very quickly. The 3 of them left the elder, running for the door. "I need you to get to David and Lorna, Raven," Leah said, as they rushed past elders conversing with a squad of hastily summoned officers. "Me?" the prince asked in surprise. She nodded and continued quickly. "Tomaz, I need you to find the supplies and horses for those who don't have them. I also need the soldiers under the direct command of the captain. Take care of gathering them as well. David and Lorna will have 20 or so pairs of rangers under them here on reserve in the city. Raven, tell them to get them ready to leave within the hour. I'm going for Captain Otmaron. We are all to meet at the northwestern entrance to the valley. From there we'll head back toward the mountains and the ambush point Elder Crane set for us. It should draw them away from the stand." "What in the name of shadows and light is the stand?" the prince demanded as they bounded up the stairs. "Aemon's stand," Tomaz rumbled. "It's where he defeated the Empress." The prince stopped dead in his tracks. What? "No time for that," Leah shouted over her shoulder. "You can ask questions later. Get to the barracks and find David and Lorna." The 2 rogues made for the door and immediately split, going in different directions without hesitation. The prince recovered quickly, dashed out of the door, and ran back for the barracks as fast as his legs would carry him. He had no time to think about kindred legends now. Clearly this stand was a fortress, and it made sense to go there. Soon enough, breathing heavily, he burst through the entrance to the barracks, seized a random soldier, and asked for the way to the ranger quarters. The man pointed up a staircase, and the prince hurried in that direction. He arrived on a small landing, accosted another man, who pointed him towards David's quarters, and soon after he found himself pounding like a madman on what he hoped was the right door. "David!" he called, trying to be heard over the din of rushing soldiers around him. "David, it's Raven, let me in!" The door opened, and David came out, fully dressed in his Eshendai uniform over a breastplate, leather jerkin, and bracers all tied in place. A small golden knot of rank on the upper right side of his chest shone brightly in the light of the hall. His Valyrian sword hung slung across his back, and his red eyes burned like fiery coals. "What?" he snapped. He pushed past the prince to cross the hall and open another door, revealing Lorna. The prince followed, and saw that the Ashandel was finishing tying her own armor in place, dyed a dark green color and much more extensive, clearly crafted to take a heavy beating. The great white axe lay close at hand. "Do you know what's going on?" Lorna asked David, ignoring the prince. "We're evacuating, and rumor has it the Oxlord is on his way." The prince was amazed to see that the Eshendai not only seemed unafraid of the prospect of fighting the Prince of Oxen, but even appeared excited by the idea. "What does he want?" the big woman asked, motioning to the prince. "I'm here with a message from Leah, via the Elder Crane." Both of them stopped doing up Lorna's armor and stared at him. "Well, tell us," the young man snapped, as if the prince were intentionally stalling. "We're setting up an ambush to draw off the main force," the prince said. "Leah says she needs you and the 20 ranger pairs under you to meet her at the northwest entrance to the valley within the next hour. The rest of the kindred are evacuating to the stand?" "The stand?" David asked in surprise. He and Lorna exchanged a significant look. The red-eyed young man turned back to the prince. "Tell Leah we'll be there." The prince turned and left the room, not quite sure what to do next. There was a sound behind him, and he turned to see David walk out of the room. The young man approached, red eyes searing the air between them. "Do they know who you are?" he asked. The prince swallowed, and 100 different responses crossed his mind, from bare-faced denial to polite confusion. But in the end he knew that the time for pretense was long past, and so he answered in earnest. Yes, I've renounced my claim to the throne and sworn myself to the elders, to Crane, until the Prince of Oxen has been repulsed. I knew they wouldn't believe me otherwise. You did what? David asked, surprise widening his terrible, glowing eyes. Now isn't the time, the prince said, suddenly angry. Do you want my help or not? No, I don't care. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for... He broke off and shook his head. David stepped forward, and the prince looked up. The red-eyed young man spoke quickly. Fine, your reasons are your own. My sister trusts you, and that's enough for now. But if you're coming with us, go to the armory. Find any spare bits of armor you can, and try not to poke anyone with the sharp point of that sword, yes? The prince nodded and hurried away. Idiot! The prince stopped. That way? David said, pointing the opposite direction before ducking back into Lorna's room and shutting the door. The prince made his way quickly down to the armory, watching the sun and the sky through various windows, trying to mark how much time was passing. Ramael was closer, that was certain, but the kindred were moving quickly, and there was a chance they would be clear of Vale before the army arrived. When he made it to the armory, the prince found it was a free-for-all. Armorers and blacksmiths were pounding madly at metal, their forges blazing as they did last-minute repairs for soldiers of every rank and file who were waiting anxiously. "Spare armor over here!" a voice was bellowing. The prince followed it into a corner, where a large-bellied blacksmith in a grimy apron with soot-stained hands and face was handing out pieces of armor to various soldiers. "What do you need?" he asked the prince. "Whatever you have," the prince responded. He was looking at the pile around the large man and saw that there was very little left. "What do you already have?" "Nothing." "You have no armor?" the man asked incredulously. "No, but I'm here on Elder Crane's orders. I need something." The man paused for a moment, and then turned and pulled out a sack from behind the counter. "Here, take these." The prince was loaded down with a leather jerkin, metal bracers and greaves, a helm that would come down to cover the back of his neck as well as the bridge of his nose, and what looked like a discarded general's breastplate with attached cape. All of it was black. "Black?" the prince asked. "An officer commissioned it and then changed his mind. I never finished gilding it. Just be thankful I had it lying around, all right? Next. Who's next?" The prince did his best to strap all of the armor in place while making his way out into the street and toward the northwestern entrance to the valley. The entire city was moving, like some enormous anthill disturbed by a child's insistent prodding. Men and women were hurriedly exchanging goodbyes. Most of the children wore expressions of fear, and more than one was crying in the middle of the street as their parents loaded wagons, carts, and anything that could carry their possessions. Soldiers dressed in green and silver uniforms rushed back and forth, organizing the evacuation and assisting with broken carts and wagons. Carpenters worked on last-minute repairs to wheels and axles, while oxen and horses, caught in a heightened state of emotion, shied fearfully. By the time the prince made it to the valley entrance, a large portion of the ambush force had already gathered. 2/3 of those assembled were men and women with bows strapped to their backs and short swords sheathed at their waists. They all wore thick leather armor with thin, rectangular pieces of metal sewn onto it to provide defense against light weaponry. The other third were rogues and rangers, dressed in black and green uniforms with swords and daggers sewn into their high collars. Some had silver accents on their armor, while others had gold, and the styles varied wildly, from one slight woman who wore nothing more than embroidered leather braces, to a large, dark-skinned man who was clad almost in a full suit of armor. The prince located Leah and quickly made his way toward her. As he came closer, he saw that she was talking quite animatedly with a man mounted on a white horse. "Just in time," Leah said, noticing him. She was dressed in the same armor as David, though her accents were silver where his were gold, and the individual pieces seemed designed for dexterity more than strength. She too had a golden knot of rank on her chest. "Who's this? You're a captain?" asked the man on the horse. He was dark-skinned, with a helm like the one the prince wore, and a similar breastplate and cape, but gilded in red. "No," the prince explained quickly. "This was the only armor they had. I'm Leah's companion." The man took this in stride and nodded. "Right, the 5th one in the tracking spell. You two stay with the other 3. He motioned to one of the groups on their right-hand side, and the prince saw that Tomas, David, and Lorna were there readying their mounts. The prince and Leah made their way over. Tomas was holding the reins of the horses they'd taken from the defenders. "Going to a funeral, princeling?" Tomas asked, noticing the prince's black armor. "I certainly hope not," he said, mounting his horse. He was surprised to find that it was fairly easy to move in the armor. "Let's go!" cried the man in the red cape and armor. "Pass the word for anyone left behind to meet us on the road!" The captain turned and rode out the gate, a pair of rogues that the prince didn't know flanking him. The force of rogues, rangers, and scouts, over 1,000 strong even without those not yet there, rode after him. "We should make it in time," the prince called to the others over the noise. "What?" "We should make it in time. Ramael will follow us. The plan might work." "Scared, princeling?" Leah asked. "Oh, I think he's properly terrified," David called over the thunder of the horse's hooves. The prince saw again the manic glint in the young man's eye, a look of demented excitement. "You're insane not to be," the prince called back. "We're about to ambush the Prince of Oxen," Tomas boomed. "We have a bare fraction of his force, we have no time to prepare or properly outfit the majority of our force, and we're racing blindly. At this point, I think we're all insane." "Exciting, isn't it?" David said, grinning widely.